I am getting, what I consider to be, concerning news about the economy, and I want to talk about why, delinquency, student loan delinquency is exploding, with 1.8 to 8.2 18.2% trillion in household debt and credit defaults that are rising over the economy. Now, I want to explain why, I would be concerned about debt within this country, okay? My life, over the course of my life, I have been a witness at this point to concerns about inflation, stagflation, and all this other stuff and all these other phenomenon. But I think there's a detail that's being missed by most households that is really distressing news to, have to report about the economy and to say, about what's going on and really going on in the economy. The trouble that, I see out there per the data and that I'm seeing out and the ill winds that I'm seeing towards this is that because most of us have only lived through an inflationary oriented crash in the economy where prices were just too high and went up and it caused financial distress for all of us. Our brains at this point have been adjusted so that we only think and see inflation and, you know, we start buying things like gold, silver, and Bitcoin in reaction to all of it as insurance against further price increases. We that's what we pour into and our assets into it, and I those all do not perform well in a deflationary scenario where the dollar is going up. Gold, silver, and even Bitcoin to some extent tend to have an inverse relationship to the dollar. If the dollar goes up, all of those assets tend to depreciate. And when I look out there at the ill winds in the economy and I see that these delinquencies are going up in auto loan delinquencies and, you know, uh, student loan delinquencies and the spillover risk that could potentially happen if student people distressed on student loans stop paying other debts, and that ends up spilling into other debt categories. So if I look at that, what goes through my head is that I think most people fundamentally misunderstand what a debt default does to the economic system because they think, okay, if people stop paying their debts, then prices are going to go up as people try to cover their losses by shafting other people with higher prices. But although prices are sticky and they don't tend to come down in reaction to the actual news of the day and what's going out, they take long. They take, sellers take some time to capitulate to the fucking, actual reality that, new reality that's happened. But if debt defaults keep going up, and there is spillover risk once we see that, that these student loan borrowers are also credit card distressed, and those start going up as a consequence of trying to pay both. When that stuff comes in, if that happens and we see increases across the board in every debt category, and we're still waiting on data in that department, but if that happens and delinquencies keep rising, then what you need to know as a person about delinquencies and credit defaults and all this is that these are fundamentally deflationary phenomenon. Now you may be sitting there like, well, that might be nice, or if that happens, if there's a deflation, wouldn't that be good news? Or you may be thinking this doesn't matter. I would encourage those of you that say that to look up what happens in a debt spiral or a deflationary spiral. Khan Academy has a whole video on it. But I would also encourage you to think about this. You know, the way that many people have oriented their portfolios is in such a manner where the only risk they're trying to mitigate against is higher prices. And I submit if these delinquencies and debt defaults keep going up, and what a default is when, the borrower just stops making payments. But if people stop paying their student loans, they stop paying their credit card bills, they stop paying their mortgages, and all these big categories of credit, what do you think creditors are going to do in response to this? Now, if I were a bank and I were responsible for lending people money, and many of my borrowers turned out to be bad risk, and they stopped making payments, what I would do is that I would basically start to demand that anybody that I did lend to had a higher credit rating. I would get more selective about who I gave money to. I would look to only give money to super prime borrowers at that point, and then at top of that, I would also demand even super high uh, lenders gave me more money, a higher interest rate for the loans that I did lend out to them, because number one, I'd have to cover my losses from elsewhere, and number two, like it like I'm scared. I'm more scared than I used to be that even the super primes might, run into problems. I'm fearful about the and concerned about the winds of the economy at that point. So credit tightens up and you end up in a credit crunch, basically where people who don't have really really good credit can't get, credit in the system at all. And then what happens in that reality is that those people stop buying as much shit as they would. They start either having to pay off their debts or they just stop spending money. They tighten their belts as a consequence of this, and that has an effect of that drags down on aggregate demand and everything because they can't borrow money to buy shit anymore. So now they have to pay for it outright if they're going to do it. And really, they probably should just be paying off the debts that they have to get out of this situation. So they stop spending money. They tighten their belts. Demand for products starts to fall. And while people who sell stuff, will not accept the reality right away, it won't set in. Eventually, they will capitulate to it. They'll have to accept it. Once they realize what's going on and the winds of this finance actually catch up to them, they will have to lower prices as a consequence of all this. And when I see all this, I'm like, maybe this is potentially good news. But it feels like we're in a very like everything bubbled because of the debt levels that are happening, and it feels like everybody is, the whole house of cards is now bet on there being a hyperinflationary scenario. But what happens if there's a hyperdeflationary scenario because of the debt levels? What if the what if delinquencies keep going up? What if this causes a credit crunch? And people, it becomes a lot more difficult to get new credit. What do you think is going to happen to all that stuff that people were, the prices for all that stuff that people were going into debt to buy? What what do you think is going to happen to all of it, in terms of prices? They're gonna have to bring them down eventually and capitulate to the fact that, the credit has now become fundamentally too hard for people to obtain, and so I look out there and I see cause for concern at this point, because I think most people seem to think that, when people stop paying their debts, prices are going to go up. And it's like, well, the price that you have interest if you borrow will have to go up, but if you're gonna buy things outright, that's not good for the price of goods. It's not even good for the price of stock, of the stock market, So because they'll have to fall rather than go up. And yes, debt defaults, when people stop paying their credit, they stop paying off the money they've borrowed, that tends to lower prices rather than raise them, because again, when creditors, don't get the money that they were expecting, they stop being as eager to lend money to anyone. The credit market tightens up and people stop being able to get loans, and so, when your economy is artificially stimulated by debt, by credit, the way that ours is, that actually has a deflationary impact.